Okay, so as people are filing in, we'll just get started with the introductions. So welcome to the first GVITE meeting of the year. For those who don't know me, my name is Jel Lumba and I'm this year's GVITE President. On behalf of the GVITE Executive, I'd like to acknowledge that where this webinar is being held in Vancouver, BC, it is also on the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. Prior to our presentation, we do have a couple of announcements. For those who don't know, it's with great sadness to share the unfortunate news of passing of Don Henderson. Not only was Don a member of GVITE, but he was also past president, a district director of CITE, and a vice president candidate for IT International. Don was a great member, and he has volunteered over 30 years to ITE to pave the way for our community and the next generation. He's the recipient of the Distinguished Service Award from both CITE and IT International. So please keep Don and his loved ones in your thoughts, and also let's celebrate what a wonderful person he was, especially to our community as we remember his legacy. The last announcement is that next month on Thursday, March 24th, the City of Vancouver will be presenting on their transport pricing project, which is part of their Climate Emergency Action Plan. So stay tuned for details in our March newsletter. So more people are filing in. Perfect timing. So let me introduce our presentation for today. Today's presentation is on the award-winning King George Boulevard Safety Review, and which is part of the City of Surrey's Vision Zero program. It's the first in-service road safety review commissioned by the City of Surrey under its Vision Zero Safe Mobility Plan. Our presenters are no stranger to GVITE, and they're Shabnem Afzal and Raheem Dilgir. Sorry, I think I might have butchered your last name. Shabnem, thanks, Raheem. Shabnem is currently the Road Safety Manager and Vision Zero Lead at the City of Surrey, where she joined in 2018 and led the development of the award-winning Vision Zero Surrey Safe Mobility Plan to eliminate death and serious injury on Surrey roads. Raheem is the President at TranSafe Consulting and also serves as the President of the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals, as well as the Chair of TAC's Vision Zero and Safe Systems Subcommittee. The plethora of experience that both Shabnem and Raheem have, particularly in the road safety sector, has contributed greatly to our community. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Shabnem and Raheem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll start off today's presentation and then I'll hand it over to Raheem. Thanks for bearing with us, by the way. We've had some technical difficulties here at the City of Surrey today with our computers, etc. Yeah, welcome to the presentation. As was mentioned, this is this road safety review was one of the first ones that we've actually done since we started our Vision Zero plan under the safe system approach. Thank you. Next slide, please. And these are all the people that were involved. So we have Raheem Dilgir, of course, and Tom Gartner, and also Mavis Johnson were the winning consultants to undertake this road safety review for the City of Surrey. Next slide, please. So as you may have heard that the World Health Organization actually called the road safety deaths a global epidemic, with 1.35 million people dying annually across the world, and those aged between 5 and 29, actually this is the leading cause of death for them. So vulnerable road users are also overrepresented in those that die on our roads, and what I mean by that, of course, is people cycling and walking, and also those on motorcycles. Next slide, please. At the City of Surrey and elsewhere, we know and we recognise that everyone has the right to safe mobility, no matter who we are, where we're going and how we're getting there. We should be able to do so safely, and collisions and death that's being caused from collisions is not acceptable. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go over really quickly the tenets of Vision Zero, just in case there's people here today who are not familiar with these tenets, and then we'll go into the actual study that we did. The first one is that collisions are preventable and that we have to change our mindset. Safety is a precondition for mobility. So it's no longer, okay to say, well, it was just an accident. We don't call them accidents, we call them collisions, because accidents makes it sound as though these things are not preventable. Of course, we know that's not true. Next slide, please. Human life is the highest priority. So we're shifting the philosophy from saying we're moving goods and vehicles to actually preserving human life and actually moving people across our networks. The transportation system needs to be designed in a way that protects those who use it. Next slide. We know that people make mistakes because we're only human. But when we do make mistakes on the road, the transportation system needs to be forgiving of those, and the system needs to be designed to accommodate human error. And that's why it's essential that we design our roadways and our urban environments in a way that they will not result in people being killed and seriously injured on our roads. Next slide. In the past, we kind of try and figure out, well, how can we educate people? How can we educate them to stop having bad user behaviors? But this really is, Vision Zero talks about a system level change. So it's not just about the road users themselves, but it's also about the policies, the systems, and as I said earlier, the built environment, that the engineering piece, and behavior change is actually secondary focus, because we know that that actually takes a long time to achieve, and it's not a short-term fix. Next slide. Speed is prioritized. We know that when we go faster, we're more likely to be in a collision, and the results of that collision are much more likely to be more severe as speed. So it increases collision risk, and it's a fundamental factor in collision severity. So that's one of the key parts of Vision Zero. Also, we know that speed is one of the factors that is more easily modifiable than other factors and can have very immediate results in terms of the harm that's done on the road. Thank you. Next slide. This actually just gives a good synopsis of a pedestrian involved in a crash with a vehicle and their chances of survivability. So as you know, it's an equation of force and blunt force trauma to the human body. And the slower we go, as we see in the 30-kilometer zone, we have a 90% chance of survival. And this decreases as speed increases. And that's one of the reasons that Surrey is currently doing a speed limit reduction pilot, results to be announced next year. Next slide, please. So this is critical because this is the safe system. We've already talked about Vision Zero and the tenets of Vision Zero, but how do we get to 0 people being killed and seriously injured? This is the system that we adopted in our Vision Zero Surrey Safe Mobility Plan, and this is the system that's also being utilised by our consultants to undertake the road safety audit. You will see there's 4 pillars in the system, and in the middle of there, we talked about the human tolerance to physical force, safe roads, obviously safe road design, the way that we can make self-enforcing roads and complete streets. That's all, within the realm of possibility of engineers and transportation. Safe speeds, we alluded to that. There's many ways that we can either enforce safe speeds through our enforcement partners and automated safety enforcement through cameras, etc., but also through self-enforcing roads again. So there are overlaps between these pillars. Safe road users, we talked about behavioural change, cultural change, but really we know that pedestrians and cyclists are much more likely to be seriously injured on our roads when they're involved in a collision. So we really need to keep that focus up, and we also partner with our enforcement agencies when we're doing our education and engagement campaigns. And safe vehicles, this is an area I think that is often something that municipalities don't gear towards because they feel that it's something that they can't necessarily control. However, there is a lot of progress in this, and autonomous vehicles, although they're a way off, they are certainly something that's in the realm of possibility in the next 10 to 15 years, that we will have that. But meanwhile, we have all sorts of safety features on safe vehicles we can advocate for and also connect with corporations and industry professionals to ensure that there's incentives to have safe vehicles. For example, ICBC offers incentives for insurance to have safe vehicles. So that's the other last tenet of the SAFE system. Next slide, please. So just to sum up then, the change from the traditional approach and the traditional, when I say traditional, I mean this is something that is traditional amongst engineers and transportation professions, but also has been the kind of opinion and cultural approach to road safety, to look at all traffic crashes. But the safe systems approach, of course, looks at crashes that result in fatal or serious injuries, and that aligns well with the Vision Zero. So while we used to look at reducing kinds of all crashes, now we're really focusing much more on reducing fatal and serious injury crashes. We're not going to be reactive anymore. We're much more focused on being proactive, looking at the data, looking to see where those serious crashes are happening, and then putting systems in place to actually prevent those crashes. We used to focus on non-compliance and really heavy reliance on enforcement, but this is now actually changing, and we're looking at more creative and innovative ways to understand that we share the responsibility for road safety. So this is a holistic approach and encourages everybody, regardless of level of government, and includes the community in terms of recognizing the responsibility towards using the roads in a safer way. And of course, the isolated interventions, going in and putting countermeasures at a specific location because there was a major crash there. We're moving away from that, but actually using things that work, measures that work everywhere where there's likely to be a crash that is fitting into that specific type of genre. Please. So as I said, the global context was the 1.3 million people dying, and in Canada that looks like 2,000 people dying on our roads. But of course in BC that's 300 people dying on our roads. Next slide, please. In Surrey, our call to action in 2019 was that we'd seen 20 people on average die on our roads every single year, and 12,000 people injured. Now, of course, these aren't just statistics. These are members of our community. These are people. They're our neighbours. They're our family. Thankfully, we've been able to push this down since 2019, and I'll talk about that later. Next slide, please. So this was our call to action, and this is our vision. Surrey has 0 people killed and seriously injured on its roads, and that human life is valued above all else in the transportation network. Next slide. Our mission is, of course, as I alluded to earlier, the mandate for road safety is dispersed amongst different levels of government, also private and public realms. So we are collaborating with our partners, and we have a Vision Zero action team that meets once a month, and that is a cross-sectoral team of partners, including health, schools, police, ICBC, and many others. Fraser Health, as I said, is a key partner too. But we're using data to take equitable actions and evidence-based actions to ensure that the city's resources are spent where they'll have the biggest impact on creating safer streets. Next slide, please. Our approach is data-driven. We look at the collision statistics. We use ICBC data and also the traffic accident system, as it's called, which is obviously police data. And we integrate these data sets here in-house to ensure that we are targeting those areas that have the most problematic kind of pictures of collisions, and we have identified top 50 high collision intersections, and we're actually about halfway or just over halfway through targeting those locations. Slide. Our focus areas, again, the data-driven approach shows that the victims of harm are cyclists and pedestrians and motorcyclists are overrepresented. Our locations of harm, we know that 80% of our collisions are happening at intersection locations. Our perpetrators of harm, we know that from the data, distracted driving, speeding, and impaired driving are the major causes of collisions. And so those behaviors are targeted through our engagement, education, and our enforcement programs. And then, of course, equity, because we know that people suffer disproportionately depending on who they are and where they live, which is an unfortunate fact now in 2022 that this is still happening. So we are really focusing all our efforts and having that as our foundation of the work that we do. Next slide, please. And as I said, 80% of our killed and serious injury collisions are happening at intersection locations, and this is a GIS map. The darker the color shows the most focused concentration, and as you see the ring there, that is exactly where our King George Boulevard corridor is. So you can see this is, this has really been problematic for many, many years. Actually, there's historical issues around this corridor, so this was definitely overdue to tackle. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've been implementing targeted safety improvements based on crash profiles. So really looking to see exactly what the problem is, not just doing one size fits all, but really making tailored to really focus on what the issues are. And the King George Boulevard corridor is what we're talking about today. Next slide, please. And here again, you see the King George Boulevard corridor. To show you and give you some context. Next slide, please. And what we know also is that we have a number of our high pollution intersections. I know Raheem will go through these in more detail, but they rank in some of the top 10, and also there's a top rank 16 and 26 also, but they all are along this corridor. Now you may be wondering, why have we not kind of dealt with this issue since it's been a historic issue? The thing is, there's a lot of history behind this, and this used to be more of a highway in historically, but now has become a much denser city environment, a much more urban environment, and has multiple users, like a lot more pedestrians, a lot more cyclists along here as well. And the use of this has really, really changed over the years. We also had plans which were put on hold because, of course, we had planned a different rapid transit along this corridor. You may remember that LRT had been planned along this, and we thought that we would, do a lot of improvements to go alongside that. However, the plans changed, and now so we're back to actually fixing the issues as we have them today. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is the historical pieces. And I'm actually going to hand over now to our Raheem, our next partner presenter. Thank you, Raheem.
Thank you, Shabnem, for that context. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see new and familiar faces. I want to start actually by saying thank you, Jill, for sharing that news about Don Henderson. I remember meeting Don very soon after I graduated from UBC, and he was a very giving in terms of his career guidance, and so I'll always have him to thank for that. So he and his family are definitely in my thoughts. I also want to acknowledge that I think probably most of you joining are located on the ancestral lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And finally, I wanted to mention that I think Tom Baumgartner's in the audience, so I'm glad he could join. He's a key member of the project team. There's a number of others that were also working with us, but good to have Tom on today. So as Shabnem just mentioned, one of the challenges here in doing the in-service review and really making an impact on the safety performance is to essentially look at changing a lot of the function, not the the foundation, but a lot of the features of the roadway in order to move it from what was historically a highway and still in some respects operates as a highway, more towards the urban corridor that is welcoming of all road users and can safely accommodate them. So every challenge is an opportunity. So we saw this as an opportunity to start making more of those changes in a meaningful way on the basis of safety. It was also, you know, right at the start, it was pretty clear that we're dealing with a very complex environment. This road does a number of things. It's a truck route, a commuter route, connects to the Patella Bridge, which will also be expanded and rebuilt shortly. A lot of businesses located along the roadway, shopping centers, all types of businesses actually. An interesting aspect was the fact that, and many of you know, that in the last few years, especially the central section of King George Boulevard has changed a lot to become a little bit more urban, but the surroundings have definitely changed and prompted a lot of that. That's where a lot of the civic and really mixed-use facilities, a lot of those facilities that make Surrey the second metropolis in Metro Vancouver. Hotels, residents, new SFU, library, so many different facilities. And that was also increasing not only vehicle traffic, but all types of traffic. It's also a cycling route in the sense that there is a large cycling demand given all the land uses and that it is a fairly direct route. It doesn't have any major deviations in it that makes it good for a lot of cycling trips as well. The problem is there's only dedicated cycling facilities towards the south end in that southern section that's shown in this map. So part of the objective was to look at how can we best protect cyclists as well. There's recreational use along the corridor. There's a lot of parks. There's the Holland Park, a lot of other recreational type facilities along the corridor. So that generates then also families even walking. Maybe the one thing that we didn't notice on the corridor, at least during the weekdays, was a lot of children crossing, just because there's no schools located that close, but it seems like the road has basically everything else, including a lot of unfortunately displaced people that are essentially using the road or the sides of the road as their home. And a lot of people pushing trolleys along the side of the road, across the road. So there are a lot of, a large range of issues that we had to take into account to try our best to protect all of those users. So what I hope to do in the time that I have here today is to give you a sense of the approach that Shabnem talked about that the city is taking. And certainly as consultants, we completely embrace that and try to exceed that and ensure that those principles were very explicitly applied at the project level. Because that's a challenge, right? You could set these visions and principles, but then how does that actually translate to the project level? So I'll demonstrate some ways that was done quite explicitly, as well as try to give you a sense of what some of the issues and recommendations were for this piece of road. In terms of the safe system approach, we embodied that in a few ways. One was by doing customized collision analysis, so a little bit different from the traditional approach. We focused on injuries and on killed and serious injuries. So you'll see examples of this as I go along here. There was a very systematic linking of the evidence. So every issue that was identified came from something concrete, and in many cases came from multiple sources. And I'll describe those a little further. We conducted an explicit human factors review. You probably know there's a lot of knowledge out there about human behavior and psychology and how that affects the safety performance, how we behave on the roadway and therefore its safety performance. So we explicitly conducted a human factors review from the perspective of various road users. We conducted a visioning exercise as well and thought very clearly about what do we want this corridor to be, or how can we best make it a safe corridor. So that thinking started at the outset, not just at the beginning of the strategies, and it helped actually guide some of the analysis. Shabnem mentioned the transit study that was also done in parallel. And we really welcomed that as a consultant, recognizing that anything that could help a mode shift to transit will improve road safety, simply because the injury rates on buses is significantly less than really any other mode of travel. Speed management strategy, was pointed out that it's a key part of the safe system approach. On this diagram here, you could see, so that was a very key component. There were a lot of equity considerations built in, not only referring to the displaced populations, but different age groups, as well as all the types of modes. There were many people that were using various types of mobility devices, mopeds, some on the sidewalk, some on the road. We tried our best to address the needs of each. And the last item, which I don't think was mentioned because it's not included in this wheel, but an important part of the safe system is post-collision care. So looking at what happens after the collision and what we can do to minimize the consequences. So in terms of that visioning exercise, this is what we had envisioned the corridor, a safe King George Boulevard corridor to be. And again, these are really standard principles that are known to work everywhere. So we didn't wait for the collision data. The collision data certainly helped in identifying locations and priorities and then actually quantifying the possible safety benefits of all of these. But these principles really apply as part of the system approach. So we envisioned a corridor that was slower, narrower, more accessible, prioritized transit, more consistent and continuous, and provided more protections for vulnerable road users. So it's quite simply put, but I think it was important to have this very clear vision of the corridor as we went through all of the analysis and the strategization. So in terms of that strategy development, there was the vision exercise, and which is really based on best practices, the human factors review that I mentioned, the data analysis, which I'll touch on as well as the stakeholder engagement. The city's Vision Zero Action Team was engaged, and the larger stakeholder group that they invited, including ICBC, the Health Authority, police, and others, to provide their input at multiple stages of the project. So all of that was considered in the identification of safety issues. Now, when we got to the safety issues, and this is something I think is really important, is to not just view a corridor project as a number of intersections. Okay, so there were those high collision intersections that of the city that were an important part of the project. But looking at those in isolation really limits the opportunities for what can be done with this corridor, such as cross-sectional changes throughout. And again, in the interest of consistency, we don't want to make isolated improvements to intersections that they might then introduce inconsistencies throughout the corridor, as well as limit the ability for other corridor changes to actually make a safety impact at the intersections. So that was a really important part, and we put therefore a lot of emphasis on the corridor-wide measures in addition to the intersection measures. A lot of the corridor-wide measures were longer term, just because they cover a lot of area, are much higher cost, but there were a few short-term ones that we identified, which I will mention. And when it came to the intersection measures, same approach. Here's what we can do now, and here's what we should be planning for in the longer term, especially to meet this, what we had identified as that ultimate vision for a safe corridor. So in terms of some of the collision data, and the title there kind of suggests the different parts of the safe system that we were trying to address as we did a different analysis. So addressing the safe road users portion by looking at collisions by mode. As I mentioned, we focused on injury collisions, not on the total collisions, including the property damage only. Still, the pedestrian, cyclists, and motorcyclists accounted for, you might say, a small number, just 8% of the total injury collisions. And we could spend a long time talking about the definition of injury and whether that's appropriate or not. But I think the more important thing was to also look at the KSI, the killed and serious injury collisions, to really get a better picture of what's causing those or which modes are involved in those. So whereas on the left graph, you can see that pedestrians made up about 5% of the injury collisions, they make up 62% of the injury collisions that are resulting in a serious injury or in a death. Okay, and then the vehicle only went from 92 down to 24%. So that really communicated to us that, if the ultimate objective of the city is to eventually get to 0 killed and serious injury collisions, there has to be a lot of countermeasures targeted towards especially pedestrian, but some of the other modes as well, and improve their safety and therefore impact the whole picture. So to that end, we conducted, as I mentioned, an explicit human factors review. And what that looked at was, what are the needs of each mode? Needs in terms of, where they need to go, what type of facility they need to do so safely. Also look at their limitations. Truly understanding each user's envelope and speed and vulnerability in the instance of a crash, but also to look at behaviors. And as was mentioned, that wasn't for the purpose of necessarily, just focusing then on, okay, what can we do to penalize people for behaving against the rules, right? It was more to inform opportunities for system design to help prevent some of those behaviors, or to better accommodate those behaviors in some cases, but hopefully through system design to actually impact those behaviors over time. We did also identify some opportunities for education and enforcement that went beyond the physical changes, or would help the public better understand the meaning of those physical changes and how to best use it as intended. And that review of human factors had a lot of components of equity and accessibility on them. And again, the whole idea is to make the corridor as welcoming as possible for all the modes that do need to use it, but as safely as possible. So that led to a lot of the things like accessibility measures, which aren't, let's say, traditionally isn't part of a safety review, is looking at people's accessibility, but that was a part of this review, or we decided to include that. So some of the kind of strategies, focus areas to improve road user safety was to look at things like speed management, dedicated spaces for dedicated modes, separation of conflict points, especially at intersections, and providing more crossing opportunities, given the changing environment and the increased demand for more pedestrians and cyclists and transit, so for access to transit as well, along this traditionally high speed and high traffic volume corridor. So I'll be giving an example, I think, of each of these in the next slides. So in terms of crossing opportunities, there were 3 specific locations that we had identified new protected crossing facility. I don't remember all the details. I think maybe 1 was a pedestrian signal and 2 were more like mid-block crosswalks, signalized crosswalks. So, and I think it turned out it was 1 in each of the 3 major sections, segments of the corridor. Also looking at dedicated spaces for cyclists. So this is a rendition showing, what it actually looks like now, I believe this is, south of 98th Avenue, which includes a bike lane. But the bike lanes do not continue north of 98th. So between 98th Avenue and 108th Avenue, there are no marked, even marked, let alone protected bicycle lanes, and cyclists are directed to move further east and use Wally Boulevard or to use the east-west routes towards another north-south facility. So that was sort of an important part, is to make those connections clear and seamless, but in the longer term to look at providing a dedicated cycling facility on the route. The issue, of course, is space. How do you fit in these things that you need, especially when part of the plan was to put in a dedicated bus lane throughout. And so those are some interesting discussions that we had about, accommodate buses more with dedicated space, or cyclists. And it turned out that with the plans that were underway with respect to the transit, the short-term approach was to proceed with those plans. provide better transit and provide better connections to the alternate facility, parallel facilities for cyclists. But if the transit plans do not proceed, then to use that space for a full cycling facility, which would then hopefully connect even further north of the north end of the study section and all the way to the Patola Bridge, which is looking at providing more dedicated and higher quality facilities for cyclists as well. So long-term commuting could be a much more viable option for cycling. In terms of speed management, there were a number of strategies that were developed. One was looking at a revised speed limit, okay, but then doing all the things that are necessary to help accomplish that speed limit. And just to kind of reinforce what I think Shabnem mentioned earlier, is that the reason for lowering the speed limit is so that speeds would be more tolerable in a crash for those pedestrians and cyclists that we know are crossing this highway and in large numbers, and sometimes not only at the intersections or designated crossing locations. So that was very important to look at a more target-based approach to speed limits, and then to do the things that are necessary to kind of get people's compliance towards everything from looking at lane widths, looking at gateway treatments, especially in the context of the city center, and to let people know, well, you're entering something a little different now. So we need to then be more alert and be at lower speeds given the mixture of activity that would be happening, as well as a couple of other strategies, which I won't spend time on today in the interest of time. But when it came to the speed zoning, one of the tools that's out there is the NACTO City Limits Guide. And by running that, you could see just how let's say how that guide is very much geared towards protection for pedestrians and cyclists. So looking at the activity level, for example, but also looking at conflict density, the number of driveways, and crossing point density. And based on that, it actually suggested that the speed limit should be 40 kilometers an hour. And I might have forgotten to mention that it's currently 60 throughout this section. So based on that tool, the speed limit would be 40 kilometers an hour, all the way from 108 to 100, and then 50 from 100 down to 96. So that was something that we looked at, and then of course thought about very much in the context of King George Boulevard, and also what might be a staged approach to get people to this perhaps ultimate vision of the corridor. Gateway treatments, I mentioned, is something that's not very common in BC. So actually I couldn't even find a BC photo. So this photo is from New Zealand, where gateway treatments are extensively used. In Canada and even in BC, gateway treatments are a little bit more used at the neighborhood level, right? When you're entering a community, or sometimes in city centers, to really communicate to the drivers that you're entering something different here. This is not what you were just doing. Now you need to do more. You need to pay more attention, go slower, expect people crossing at any moment. That's the purpose of a gateway treatment, is to reinforce that speed limit and that message of what the mindset that all road users need to have. In terms of safe roads, there were a lot of system changes that were recommended to address some of the issues. And these are all proven measures, so we were really looking for every opportunity to incorporate these. So protected only left turns, smart right turn channels, and that's what's in the figure that you see here, or in some cases a complete removal of right turn islands, and just have the right turns controlled by the traffic signal to better control speeds, better manage conflicts, better improve visibility for pedestrians and other traffic. Also improving wayfinding, the street name signs, et cetera, because it's not only for locals that we're operating these roads, but it's for visitors as well, and Surrey's getting more and more visitors. Raised pavement markers and signal visibility improvements were among some of the other road changes that were recommended at a number of locations. I mentioned transit, dedicated spaces for transit. So in both directions, there was a dedicated curb bus lane that could be used also for business access or for right turns at upcoming intersections. But the primary purpose was would be colored such that it be clearly recognized as a transit only lane, except for that local access. And in fact, along one portion of the corridor, it was proposed in the left turn lane to northbound left turn lane to provide better access to the bus loop, which is located further west on University Boulevard. So, and then connections to the bus facilities. Now, just skipping ahead a little, I know we don't have too much time left, is just to give you a sense of some of those corridor. I mentioned the emphasis on the corridor as much as the intersections. So this is a list of some of the corridor measures for which it was possible to actually conduct a benefit cost analysis. And often corridor measures are excluded, but we thought it was very important to include it to show the possible impact, even if there aren't that many published values, to use our engineering judgment, which I think as a team we'd really accumulated over the years, to estimate what could be the possible impacts of some of these corridor-wide measures. And this gives an idea of not only the types of measures, but the impact that they could possibly have. So just looking at the speed management related recommendations, by reducing the speed limit throughout from 60 to 50, which was the short term, I think this covers the short-term improvements. In the longer term, we recommended to look at 40 for that city center section, but to start with moving to 50 kilometers an hour for this whole section in the short term. But to help accomplish that through reducing lane widths to a range of widths depending on what was available in those sections and how much we could take away from other things. Gateway treatments, signal coordination. Just looking at the speed management, it was estimated that up to 138 injury collisions over 3 years could be prevented. So significant numbers. And this was consistent with the Vision Zero approach, right? If we're not going to take bold approaches and recommend bold solutions, it's going to take longer and longer to get to that ultimate goal. So we understand that there's a lot of things that the city and others need to balance in terms of actually implementing, but as the consultant, we didn't let that hold us back from putting all of these ambitious goals on the table. Just to look at accessibility, there are some proven safety benefits of these accessibility measures, and we were able to estimate that up to 12 to 19, let's say, injury collisions could be prevented over 3 years just from these accessibility measures, like reducing the corner radii, providing accessible ramps and accessible push buttons everywhere at all signalized intersections and all pedestrian crossing facilities. And then the additional pedestrian or traffic signals could impact another 13. So anyway, it goes on and on, narrowing the corridor by either increasing the width of the median or, in addition to the lane reductions already recommended, reducing signal cycle lengths, better defining the bike space. And there's a lot of very specific suggestions that were made, and Tom Baumgartner was really leading that part of it. So if you have any questions on that, he might be able to help answer them. But looking at even interactions between cyclists and buses, continuity for bus movements, bike movements on all sides of the intersection. For example, in some cases, there was a facility on one side of the intersection, but to get across to the other side, there wasn't they would simply have to walk in the crosswalk without a dedicated connecting facility. So cross rides at wherever it was possible and things like that. So I'm sorry, at the bottom of the slide, I've kind of gone right to the edge in order to keep the font size manageable. But at the end of the day, just the corridor-wide measures, not even looking specifically at the intersections, had the potential to prevent 184 injuries over 3 years, okay, or 60 a year, you could describe it as. And that's up to 20% of those injury collisions occurring on the corridor, just by looking at these corridor-wide measures. So if we had ignored that, and just focused on the intersections, we would be missing out on this. But in terms of the intersections, it was, the numbers. So we looked at the costs as well as the benefits, and really what it showed is that you get positive benefit costs at just about every intersection. It was a little bit lower at 98th Avenue and a little bit higher, in fact, significantly higher at 96th Avenue. And 96th Avenue, just to give an example, included recommendations for protected only left turn lanes in the east-west direction, smart right turn channels on all corners, and improvements to both the cycling and the bus lanes. And also improving signal visibility, providing the gateway treatment at the northbound so that people entering this busy section would get that warning of the need to pay more attention and to slow down, as well as even automated enforcement if that's something that becomes viable. That could have a significant impact as well to help accomplish that or achieve that lower speed limit, the lower speeds. And overall, a return just within 3 years of 2 to 4 on the costs. There was another analysis based on 25 years, which resulted in even much higher returns. But just for the sake of today, I'm sharing the 3-year analysis. So the capital costs, it's not cheap, but to achieve this number of possibly prevent this number of injuries, it's a cost that I think we could probably accept as a society, $2 million, just for the intersections. So I'm just going to skip that. I know we're at the end. And yeah, just to add it all up, add up the intersection and the short-term corridor-wide improvements, the total potential prevention of collisions is up to 40% of all injury collisions could be prevented. Now there is overlap here and there, and we tried to account for those things as best as we could, but that's the kind of the upper end is 40%, which is very significant, and it's because the safe system approach was applied that there is this potential for achieving that bold target. And one of the things we wanted to look at is how all of these safety improvements might impact capacity, because there may be this myth out there that all safety improvements do have a negative effect on capacity, meaning increasing delays or decreasing throughput and things like that. So yeah, some of them did, but it was interesting to discover that in most cases the impacts were negligible or minor. They were a little bit higher for at a couple of the intersections, and I think those were mostly related to the protected left turn movements. So I think that's something that, again, we may be willing to accept, going from a level of sort of C to a D, and waiting 12 more seconds or 7 more seconds here for vehicles in order to prevent that number of injury collisions. So yeah, it took a bit long there, but I'm glad that there is a few minutes left for questions, and would be happy to do my best to answer those.
Thanks, Raheem, and thanks, Shabnem, for your presentation. For those who have questions, you can enter your questions on the right-hand corner where there's a chat box, and you also have the option to turn on your mic and/or camera to speak out your question. So Archegidis asked, was the safety review done previously for this corridor? If so, how much of it was implemented?
No, the answer to that is no, there wasn't a safety review done. I think the only safety pieces that were looked at were as part of a design for the LRT. So obviously not having LRT, none of that was implemented.
So I can just add that going back to a few earlier years, in 2012, when I was involved in leading, developing the first draft of the city's safe mobility plan, looking at some of the high collision corridors was a part of that. So there were a number of suggestions made at that time, but I believe that the safe mobility plan went through a number of evolutions since then. So I think since that time, this was the first.
Yeah, evolutions would be an understatement, Raheem. We started from scratch. Yeah, because we went towards Vision Zero, as you know. So when I joined in 2018, we started from scratch. And of course, as we know, the numbers change, right? So collisions change, patterns change. The key things I think to remember is that we have about 1,000 people move to Surrey every single month. So we are one of the fastest growing municipalities in BC, and actually will be the most populous in a number of years, overtaking Vancouver. So that really impacts the collision picture. The types of road users are also very different, and we have a lot more density in urban areas too. So yeah, it would not be applicable to the current state today. What data sets are used?
Oh yeah.
Is ICBC, but also, as I mentioned earlier, we always use, you know, the TAS data too. Raheem, you did the analysis along with Tom, and we also, you know, look at things like, you know, the volumes and those types of things as well.
I didn't hear that too well, but yeah, no, a number of the recommendations that were made in that first draft did actually translate to the current study, but had to certainly be customized to reflect the current traffic patterns and things that had changed since then. Other questions?
So Eric Tam has a comment and question. He says, nice presentation. Thanks, Shabnem and Raheem. Question on the benefit cost analysis. Were travel time costs considered? Also, would improvements to transit negate any increased private vehicle travel times?
Yeah, if you're able to just mute yourself, Shabnem. So there was no travel time study conducted formally as part of it. As I mentioned, there was the operation analysis did look at delays, so there's a bit of a reflection in there, but Billy, no formal travel time analysis.
Monique commented in question, great presentation, thank you. You spoke about the trade-offs between mobility and safety. Can you comment on how that was received by the various work units at the city and with transit, please?
I guess I can take that one. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it just has a little bit of buzzing in the background.
Oh, okay, my apologies.
Yeah, it's actually very difficult to hear you. There's some kind of fuzzy noise going on.
Okay, you know what I could do is actually just, I might just join the meeting on my phone. 1 second.
Perhaps in the meantime, I can mention that, yeah, it was really interesting to hear the different perspectives around the table from the Vision Zero Action Team. And there were various departments of the city, as well as some external groups, as I mentioned. And yeah, there was definitely pushback on some of those, Monique, as you wouldn't be surprised. And so they were discussions, right? There were discussions about, okay, these are the trade-offs. And then I think there was some evolution in some of the thinking in some respects. And interestingly, there were a lot of things we were able to identify that improved both safety and capacity. So that's where it was kind of a win-win and everybody was happy, but that was definitely an interesting thing. And I guess it's Shabnem's challenge now, and as she'll probably speak to, is then actually getting back towards implementation and going through the whatever other hoops are necessary to justify those safety improvements.
Sorry about that. Can you see me?
We can hear you, Shabnem.
Okay, great. I've got you on my phone now, so hopefully this works. Yeah, there's always challenges in terms of whenever you try and do something different with road safety and Vision Zero. Yes, and that's my job. It's my team's job and my job to actually promote and advocate for the road safety interventions that we want. And yeah, there's always going to be those costs. And really, it's a cultural change, as I mentioned earlier. It's something that we're always working at, and it's something that hasn't been easy, obviously. But I think when you really spell it out, and I think that's why we wanted the cost-benefit analysis within this study, because it's really helpful for us when we can use that concrete data and information on the costs and the benefits to actually advocate for those changes that we need. And that makes it much easier to make a business case for those things, because really ultimately the answer is, what is the right cost of human life? Like, how much are we willing to lose? And you know, you see lots of videos around Vision Zero, around what's the acceptable number of people to die in collisions. Well, of course it's 0, right? And so we have to ultimately we have to continually get that message across, and it's sometimes it can be challenging. I won't say that that's you know, that's not happening. It does get challenging at times. So yeah.
Maybe I'll just add that in a larger study, it might be possible to do things like estimate multimodal level of service, and that could then be looked at side by side with the more vehicle-based level of service analysis, and help also justify those improvements on a mobility basis, but mobility for all modes, not just vehicles.
Thanks. And we have one last question. Raheem, can you comment on some of the assumptions made to identify the reduction in collisions achieved by the recommendations?
Oh, sure. As I mentioned, we didn't do it for everything, but we did it for many of them, especially the ones that we know could have a significant impact. So we definitely did start with looking at the literature from the various sources, the Highway Safety Manual, Collision Modification Factors Clearinghouse, more local resources from the BC Ministry and ICBC. But we, our job is not to just apply those numbers without thinking. So there were many cases where we had to modify, or in some cases disregard, because the context didn't match the context of the roadway. So I think those, in the report, there may be a bit more of an explanation for those ranges. There were ranges provided to account for some uncertainty. And to be honest, most of the ranges were on the conservative side. So the benefits could be a lot more achieved if we were to simply use the numbers that were found in literature.
Perfect. Well, that concludes our time together. Thank you again to Raheem and Shabnem for presenting, and we'll see each other next month at our next meeting. Thank you.